I don't know if over the 18 months I've been here, or however many months, I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a bit of rotation that goes with sermon topics. So I'm going to just let you know what the secret is. Most of the time, I try to switch out from 5 different areas. There's Unitarian Universalist history and theology. Next Sunday is going to be about that. It's going to be about seeing the world through the eyes of Latina and African American women in the context of our UU theology. The second one is personal spiritual growth, and that is spiritual with or without God. What it means is finding a deeper understanding. The third one is who we are in relationship to events around Bozeman or in our state or in our nation, in our world. A few sermons have celebration and whimsy, like the one last week on silliness. And the fifth one is how faith forms our social justice work, which I think today's sermon fits mostly into number 5. Not that I can't mix and match. And please, another call. If you have a sermon topic you are dying to have me address, let me know. Your Sunday services, which is like Carolyn and I and the rest of people that make up that committee, and our children's religious exploration, we also use like a curriculum, words of wisdom, readings from what's called Soul Matters. They have a monthly theme, and our monthly theme this time is the gifts of justice and equity, which is how we got to a sermon on money. And I don't mean our fabulous pledge drive that we finished in November and December. I mean economic justice. If you are in the upper middle class, or the top 10% of the wealthiest in America, this sermon has the potential to make you uncomfortable. That's not my intent, to make you uncomfortable if you have money. My intent is to make you thoughtful. What I want for us most is to just learn new information and to think about how money works in our community. I want to start with thinking about what $1 billion really is. Sarah Lease writes for the Pitt News, which is the University of Pittsburgh's newspaper. One of her articles is about economic disparity, and she titled it, "There Are No Ethical Billionaires." And you'll have to just see if you agree. And I quote, "Through the typical immoral strategies used to earn and maintain $1 billion." So again, she doesn't say all, she just says the typical, such as investments in big oil, technology expansion that's reliant on the abuse of natural resources, and manufacturing reliant on the exploitation of workers. I have recently come to believe that no one can truly be a good person while owning $1 billion. Not to mention the understanding that an individual with $1 billion in accumulated wealth, assets, and investments actively chooses not to ease the suffering of millions, even billions worldwide, instead hoarding a fortune that's too much for any one person to reasonably spend. Unquote. She also has a fun way for you to start wrapping your head around what $1 billion really is. So 1 million seconds is equal to about 11 days. 1 billion seconds is roughly equal to 31.5 years. If you had $1 million and you spent them at $1,000 a day, you would run out of money in 3 years. And in contrast, if you had $1 billion and spent the same $1,000 a day, it would take you 2,740 years to spend the money. And in reality, it would take longer because your investments would be earning more money all that time. So let's just round it up to 3,000. And if you earned $7,000 an hour since the beginning of the Common Era, so that's a little over 2,000 years, you would have 124 billion by now, and you would still have less than Jeff Bezos. So Sarah Lease does make space. She makes a little space for charitable billionaires. but points out they donate only a fraction of their wealth, and they live in ways that take a disproportional share of the resources and create immense environmental damage by having extravagant lifestyles, such as flying in their private jets. Okay. That's from Sarah Lees. But it is true that the wealthiest 1% of American families own roughly 34% of our country's wealth. And the bottom 50%, 2%, sorry. The wealthiest pay only 25.6 of all taxes. And to remind you of the statement by United States House Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who sounds like she would get along great with Sarah Lees. She says, no one ever makes $1 billion. They take $1 billion from others. And while that may be in exchange for goods, it is still someone else that is creating their wealth. So I want to also connect poverty to mental health. There are many ways that poverty negatively impacts our poor. Lack of adequate housing, poor nutrition, reduced access to health care, reduced access to healthy food, lower quality education, just to name a few, and the impact on mental health. So Carolyn, who was just up here, really pushed me to include how despair can lead to suicide and how that is wrapped up in this economic picture. And it was a little bit surprising to me. Suicide claimed the lives of 453,577 adults between the ages of 25 and 64 from 1999 to 2016, so that's 17 years. In the first version of the sermon, I rounded that off to 450,000, just so that you could get your head around it more easily. And then I decided that was incredibly disrespectful to not include every single life. So 453,577. So the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says we've had a 33% increase in suicide during those years. And where that really shows up is in rural areas, not inner city. The states and areas most affected, you'll be happy to know it's not Montana, but Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, so our neighbors. Also the states that make up Appalachia and states that are tethered by the Ozarks. It's Ohio State University who's done the most recent research on these rural communities. And they say that is where suicide has risen the fastest and the furthest. So predominantly white people who used to live a nice middle-class existence, but due to economic downturn and loss of employment, and loss of communities, as there's less money in the community, businesses close, and there's less places to gather, there are less celebrations to gather. The despair can go on for decades. So it's the theory. There's a correlation that is stronger in the rural than the urban areas. And the theory is, according to the Ohio study and other things I've read, that the long-entrenched poor, often communities of color, appear able to fend off despair by accessing shared resources like city parks and neighborhoods and barbershops and beauty shops and community churches. So they tap into social networks that have sustained them during not only years of hardship, but generations of hardship. So in other words, they've been doing it longer, so they've found some better ways to cope emotionally. And while this is a testament to the strength and creativity of these communities and these families, it's really a tragic statement about the relativity that hardship for those communities has persisted for so long. So I have been reading Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America. I've also been reading some other things, and these are theories he's put forward, but I also have a master's in social work, so I have a lot of history of reading studies on poverty. And so of the things I read, I felt most in concert with Desmond, but that doesn't mean you need to agree with him. So Desmond, who wrote this book, he also wrote, prior to this, he wrote a book called Evicted, and he's talking about how landlords create such benefit of evicting people and how the cycle is so vicious because then once you have an eviction, it's much harder to get another rental, and it's just a downward spiral. So he says that the American government gives the most help to those who need it the least, saying our true nature of our welfare state goes to the very rich. And he says that has not only far implications for our bank accounts and those who live in poverty, but our entire community emotional spirit and our civic spirit. He quotes that by his estimate that by simply collecting on unpaid federal income taxes from the top 1% of households would bring us some $175 billion a year. So remember, if you made $7,000 an hour from the birth of Christ, he's going to collect more. $175 billion would be more than that $7,000 an hour. He says we could just about fill the entire poverty gap in America if the richest among us simply paid the taxes they owe. He says the same about corporate America. And I don't know if you noticed, but Charles Littlejohn was in the news again this week. Now, you might not remember his name, but you will remember what he did. So in 2019, the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, Charles Littlejohn was an IRS employee. No longer. He leaked the tax returns of thousands of the richest people in America and the tax returns of Donald Trump. And according to Desmond, the returns show that this group paid little or no federal taxes. He's in the news again because about 2 weeks ago, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the unlawful leak of this confidential information. I had a lot of feelings about that, which I still haven't resolved. So Desmond says we have some hard questions to grapple with. And he says America keeps people in poverty. And he wants us to understand how we play a part in that. He says that poverty in America exists because the rest of us benefit from it. Of course, some people benefit much more than others. And it was a really depressing and disturbing thought. He says, we exploit the poor, we drive down their wages while forcing them to overpay for housing and to overpay for cash and credit. We prioritize the subsidization of our wealth over the alleviation of poverty. I'm going back and forth about how many statistics I want to give you. There's so much and it's so hard to remember. But what he's trying to do to illustrate this is saying that the average household at the bottom 20% receives roughly $25,700 in government benefits a year. So these are families living on or below the poverty line. So $25,700 a year. But the average household in the top 20% receives about $35,000, 40% more in government subsidy. And if you put aside the tax breaks and judge the United States solely by the share of the gross domestic product allocated to programs for low income, then our investment in poverty reduction is much smaller than other rich nations. Desmond points out that tax cuts by Congress are a major factor in not being able to fund the right programs, bring about better housing, or better schools. The largest tax cut in U.S. history was the Economic Recovery Act of 1981. According to Desmond, and according to other things I've read, although not the most recent article about poverty in the Washington Post. That white lead tax revolt that went on the country at the time was a spillover for legislation that demanded whites share their public goods and spaces with Black people, including neighborhoods, parks, and schools. Efforts at national health insurance in the 60s would have passed, except that Black people would have been included, and that was the major objection. So the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 was proposed by Congressman Jack Kemp, approved by Republicans, but also approved by many Democrats, and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. It reduced federal tax revenues by more than 13%, including a 20% reduction in the top marginal tax rate, and slashed the estate taxes. Most shocking, during the Reagan years for funding the Department of Housing and Urban Development, so the people who build and maintain low-income housing, was cut by 70%. So here, because of the cuts, even for the housing that was already built, they couldn't pay to have the trash collected, they couldn't pay for any upkeep, and I don't know if you remember, but that was also the time that they needed to take lead paint out of this housing. So there are three ways that we exploit the poor, according to Desmond. We constrain their choices and power in the labor market, in the housing market, and in the financial market, driving down wages while forcing the poor to overpay for housing and overpay to have access to cash or credit. Because we all benefit from cheap goods and services that the working poor produce. And so do those of us who directly or indirectly invest in the stock market. Again, when I look at my retirement funds, I have mixed feelings and lots of questions for myself. Financial exploitation of the poor occurs from those payday lending places who charge 10%, and then there are fines for late payback. And interestingly to know, the majority of people do pay back the loans. It takes them longer, and they end up paying back, on average, double. But they do pay it back. Desmond has a lot of ideas about what we can be doing. One of the first ones is fully fund the IRS so that they can actually do their job, and let them do their job. Stop creating such a gap between prosperous and exclusive communities, which then creates neighborhoods of poverty. He says the concentration of affluence breeds more affluence, and poverty, more poverty. To be poor is incredibly difficult, but to be surrounded by poverty on all sides, and all that entails in loss, is a much deeper negative influence. He's talking about no banking, he's talking about no grocery stores, he's talking about schools that provide less of a quality education. So if you read Desmond's book, he has many more suggestions. He advocates for the rich and corporations pay their share. Fully fund the IRS. He advocates for wage reform. I come from Seattle. We bucked our minimum wage up to almost $20 an hour with no problems, no reduction in the amount of Subway sandwiches that people were buying. It all stayed the same. And then poor people working at minimum wage have more money to spend, which then benefits the economy. So wage reform, and especially from discouraging landlords from exploiting the poor. Do you know the poor pay almost as much to rent their shabby apartment than I do to rent out of my brand new apartment building that's been there, I don't know, for 3 years? He reminds us that millions of poor renters accept exploitive housing conditions, not because they can't afford better alternatives, but because they aren't offered any. because better places won't rent to them. He also talks about empowering the poor and ending exclusive communities. I'm going to wrap this up now. And I want to say you should all be incredibly proud of yourselves for the work you do supporting Family Promise. Family Promise is our boots on the ground organization here in Bozeman. There's a tub right over there if you want to make in-kind donations, who really go in there when people are living on that line between homelessness and needing to get into housing. And they work with them, and they work with providing immediate aid, short-term aid, and then try to get them into a longer-term situation. So you should all be proud of the support work we do there. And we gave them the offering last Sunday, or whatever the second Sunday was in January. Sorry, lost track of time. So I really encourage you to get educated. You certainly can borrow Poverty by America, and you may not agree with everything in that book. You can read the latest article in the Post, which takes a different tack. They say our problem's not so related to disparity or racial influences. But finally, I'm going to leave you with the words of Leo Tolstoy, who, when he moved from a rural setting into the city of Moscow, he was shocked by the difference in the poor. He said, I'm used to country poor. I know what that looks like, but people still have enough to eat because if they're working the land. But he was just appalled by the despair and the deprivation of the poor in the city right next to all the affluence. And he finally concluded, it is because the really wealthy were just living such useless lives. So Tolstoy has advice for us. He says, if you want to aid the poor, that is, to help the poor not be poor, I ought to not make them poor. So please use your vote, please use your checkbook, and use your voice. Amen. And borrow the book.